August 13, 1961. Berlin. Georg Vasser stared at the barbed wire stretching across Bernauer Strasse, the reality of what had happened overnight still sinking in like a stone in his stomach. Soviet and East German soldiers stood guard, their faces grim, weapons ready. The barrier, crude but unmistakable in its purpose, now divided the city that had already been split for years between East and West. "Papa, what are they doing?" 8-year-old Lena tugged at his sleeve, her small face pinched with confusion. "They're building a wall," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper, "to keep us in." Next to him, his wife Greta squeezed his hand, her fingers cold despite the warm August morning. Her face had gone pale, eyes fixed on the soldiers. "We should go home," she whispered. Behind them, a crowd had gathered, Berliners watching in stunned silence as their city was physically torn in two. Some wept openly. Others shouted angry protests at the guards who stared back impassively. As George turned his family away from the scene, his brother-in-law Fritz fell into step beside them. "They did it," Fritz muttered. "The bastards actually did it." "Not here," George cautioned, nodding toward Lena and their younger son, Martin, who was barely 5. The walk back to their apartment in East Berlin was silent and heavy. 2 years earlier, George had been approached to take a teaching position at Humboldt University, a prestigious opportunity for a mathematician like him. It had meant relocating his family from Dresden, but the promise of better housing and a good salary had been impossible to refuse. Now he understood the terrible mistake he had made. Inside their 4th-floor apartment, with the children sent to their room, the adults finally spoke freely. "We're trapped," Greta said, her voice breaking as she poured coffee with shaking hands. "Completely trapped." Fritz leaned forward. "It's only barbed wire and soldiers for now. They can't build a real wall overnight." "They don't need to," George replied. "The message is clear. No more commuting to jobs in the West. No more visiting family. No more escaping." He nearly spat this last word. "They've been planning this," Fritz said. "The production quotas, the crackdowns on Western sympathizers, the increased Stasi presence. They're losing too many people to the West." Over 2.5 million East Germans had fled to West Germany since 1949. The brain drain was devastating the East German economy. "What are we going to do?" Greta asked, her eyes moving to the door behind which their children played, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding around them. George had no answer. His position at the university had increasingly come with political strings attached, pressure to join the party, to attend meetings, to demonstrate loyalty. He had resisted as long as he could, making excuses, but he knew time was running out. Either he would eventually be forced to comply or he would lose his position, and possibly much more. "We wait," he said finally. "We watch, and we look for opportunities." December 15, 1962. East Berlin. 16 months had changed everything. The crude barrier of August 1961 had evolved into a sophisticated system of concrete walls, guard towers, dog runs, and a death strip, where anyone attempting to cross would be shot without warning. The Berlin Wall, as it was now universally known, had transformed from emergency measure to permanent fixture. George stood at his living room window, watching the snow fall over the gray cityscape. The radio droned in the background, another report about production quotas being exceeded, about the imperialist threats from the West, about the glory of the socialist state. Behind him, Martin played with wooden blocks while Lena read a book approved by her school. Greta sat mending clothes, her face prematurely lined from the stress of the past year. "Turn that off," George said suddenly. The propaganda had become unbearable. When the apartment fell silent, he could hear what had become the ambient soundtrack of their lives. The heavy boots of Volkspolizei patrolling the streets below, the distant announcements from loudspeakers, the careful, measured conversations of neighbors who feared being overheard. "Herr Muller didn't come home last night," Greta said quietly. Their neighbor across the hall, a music teacher who had made the mistake of commenting that Western orchestras had better instruments. George nodded grimly. "Frau Muller says he's visiting family in Leipzig." Neither believed this. No one visited family without warning, without packing, in the middle of the night. There was a knock at the door. George tensed, exchanging a glance with Greta, who quickly ushered the children into their bedroom. When he opened the door, relief flooded through him. It was only Fritz, snow melting on his hat and coat. "May I come in?" Fritz asked formally, aware that neighbors might be listening. Once inside with the door closed, Fritz's demeanor changed. "I've made contact," he whispered, removing his wet hat. "There's a group helping people get out. But it's dangerous, George. People have died trying." George had known for months that Fritz was looking for escape routes. His brother-in-law worked for the Railway Administration, a position that gave him access to information about transportation and border controls, but also placed him under constant scrutiny. "How dangerous?" George asked. Fritz glanced toward the children's bedroom. "Very, but staying might be worse in the long run. The university committee asked about you again today." George felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. The committee, effectively a Stasi-controlled oversight group, had been pressuring him to inform on colleagues and students. His continued refusals had been met with increasing hostility. "What did you tell them?" "That you were completely loyal to the party and the Republic," Fritz said with a bitter smile. "But they know it's not true. They're watching you more closely now." Greta had returned and stood in the doorway, her face tight with fear. "Who is helping people escape?" she asked. "A network," Fritz replied vaguely. "People on both sides of the wall. They have different methods. Tunnels, forged papers, hidden compartments in vehicles. Nothing is guaranteed." "And the cost?" George asked, knowing such operations weren't run on goodwill alone. "All our savings. Everything we can liquidate without raising suspicion." Fritz hesitated. "And there's something else. We'd have to be separated initially. Different routes, different times." Greta shook her head immediately. "No, we stay together or we stay here." "It may be the only way," Fritz insisted. "For adults and two children trying to cross together, the risk is too high." George looked at his wife, seeing the fear in her eyes but also the steel beneath it. "We have time," he said. "Let's not make hasty decisions." But as Fritz left an hour later, George knew time was actually running out. The walls were closing in, not just the concrete one dividing Berlin, but the invisible ones of suspicion, surveillance, and political pressure. March 3, 1963. East Berlin. Professor Vasser? George looked up from his desk to see a young man standing in his office doorway. Dieter Hoffmann, a third-year mathematics student with sharp eyes and a party pin on his lapel. "Yes, Herr Hoffmann? The dean wishes to see you. Immediately." George carefully arranged his papers, trying to calm the sudden racing of his heart. "Of course." As they walked through the mathematics building, George was acutely aware of the young man watching him. Hoffmann had appeared in his advanced calculus class 3 months ago, a late transfer with mediocre mathematical skills but excellent political credentials. Dean Werner Schmidt was not alone in his office. A plain-clothed man sat beside his desk, his face expressionless. "Ah, Professor Vasser. Please, sit down." Schmidt gestured to the chair across from him. "This is Comrade Kraus from the Ministry of State Security, a Stasi officer." George kept his face neutral as he sat. "Comrade." Kraus didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Professor, we have concerns about your commitment to our socialist principles." "I've served Humboldt University faithfully for 4 years," George replied carefully. "Service to the university is not the same as service to the state," Kraus countered. "You've refused multiple invitations to join the party. You've been reluctant to participate in our information-sharing initiatives about Western sympathizers in academic circles." Information sharing, a euphemism for informing on colleagues. "My focus has been on mathematics, comrade. Politics is not my area of expertise." Kraus's lips tightened. "In our republic, everything is political, Professor. Mathematics included. Especially when we learn that you've been receiving scientific journals from West Berlin through unauthorized channels." George felt a cold wash of fear. Fritz had occasionally brought him mathematical journals published in the West, material technically banned but essential for keeping current in his field. I was unaware that reviewing academic literature required special authorization, he said, knowing the defense was weak. Your brother-in-law, Fritz Lehmann, has been observed engaging in suspicious activities, Kraus continued, ignoring George's response. As a railway administrator, he has access to sensitive information about our transportation networks, information that would be valuable to Western intelligence agencies. Fritz is a loyal citizen, George said, his mouth dry. If he's brought me academic journals, it was only to assist my research. Dean Schmidt looked uncomfortable but remained silent as Kraus leaned forward. Professor Vasser, we're giving you an opportunity to demonstrate your loyalty. We need you to report on your brother-in-law's activities and contacts. Additionally, we require regular reports on the political reliability of your colleagues and students. There it was, the demand he had been dreading for months. And if I continue to focus solely on mathematics? George asked, already knowing the answer. Kraus's smile was thin. Then perhaps your talents would be better utilized elsewhere. The chemical plants in Bitterfeld always need educated men for their most hazardous divisions. And of course, your children's educational opportunities would need to be reevaluated. The threat was clear. George would either become an informant or his career would be destroyed and his family would suffer. I understand, he said quietly. May I have some time to consider my response? Of course, Kraus said, standing. You have until Monday. Think carefully, Professor. Your future, and your family's, depends on making the correct choice. That night, after the children were asleep, George told Greta everything. We have to leave, she said immediately, her face pale but resolute in the dim light of their kitchen. If you refuse them, they'll destroy us. If you comply, they'll own you, and eventually, they'll ask you to inform on me, on our friends, even on the children's teachers. Fritz thinks he's found a way, George admitted. But it means splitting up initially. You and the children would go first. Fritz and I would follow later. How? He didn't give details. The safer if we don't know until it's time. But he says there's a group that's successfully helped families cross. They have connections with people in the West who are waiting to receive us. Greta was silent for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of now cold tea. When? As soon as possible. Before Monday. She nodded, a single tear tracking down her cheek. Then we'll do it. Whatever it takes. March 5, 1963. East Berlin. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of careful, clandestine preparations. They could take nothing suspicious, pack nothing obvious. They converted what savings they could into Western currency through Fritz's black market contacts. A dangerous transaction that could have resulted in immediate arrest. Fritz arrived at their apartment just after nightfall, his face grim. It's arranged. Greta and the children leave tomorrow at 10 a.m. George and I will follow in 3 days. How? Greta asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Fritz glanced at the children, who were being kept occupied with a board game in the corner of the living room. You'll take the S-Bahn to Friedrichstrasse station. You'll be met by a woman named Helga who will give you further instructions. You'll have papers identifying you as West Berlin residents who were visiting family in the East. False papers? George asked, alarmed. If they're discovered, they won't be, Fritz assured him. They're genuine documents with altered information. The group has contacts within the document offices. And the children? Greta pressed. They'll be questioned. They might say something. They've been briefed on what to say, Fritz explained. They'll tell the children it's a game, that they're playing spies and must stay perfectly in character. Martin is young enough that border guards won't question him extensively. Lena is old enough to understand the importance of following instructions precisely. George exchanged a look with Greta. Their children's lives would depend on their ability to maintain a fiction under intense pressure. And us? George asked. How will we cross? Fritz lowered his voice further. There's a tunnel, under Bernauer Strasse. It's nearly complete. In 3 days it will be ready. We'll cross at night. Tunnels were among the most dangerous escape routes. Several had collapsed, killing those inside. Others had been discovered by the Stasi, resulting in shootouts and arrests. "Is there no other way?" George asked. "Not for us," Fritz said grimly. "We're both being watched now. The border crossing method only works for people who aren't already under suspicion. Our only chance is the tunnel. The group has gotten 26 people out already using it. And if we're caught?" Greta asked the question they'd all been avoiding. Fritz didn't sugarcoat it. "Prison. 20 years minimum. Possibly worse if they decide to make examples of us." They all knew what worse meant. Though East Germany officially abolished the death penalty for all but exceptional cases, people still disappeared into prisons never to emerge again. "We should get the children to bed," George said finally. "Tomorrow will be difficult for everyone." As Fritz prepared to leave, he handed George a small folded paper. "Memorize this address. It's where you'll meet Greta and the children in West Berlin if everything goes as planned. Destroy it afterward." George committed the Kreuzberg address to memory, then burned the paper in the kitchen sink. After Fritz left, he and Greta sat with the children, explaining as gently as they could what would happen the next day. "It's very important that you follow exactly what Mama and the nice lady tell you tomorrow," George told them. "It's like a special game, but you must play your parts perfectly." "Will you be coming with us, Papa?" Lena asked, her eyes wide with confusion. "I'll join you very soon," he promised, praying it was true. Just a few days later, "Uncle Fritz and I have some important work to finish first." Later, after the children were asleep, George held Greta in their bed, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. "If something goes wrong," she whispered against his chest. "If we're separated—" "We won't be," he interrupted firmly. "But if we are," she insisted, "I want you to know that I would make the same choice again. Even knowing everything that would happen, I would still choose you. Our life together." George felt tears burning behind his eyes. 3 days, he promised. 3 days and we'll be together again. In the West. Free. Neither of them slept that night. March 6, 1963. Friedrichstrasse Station. Greta held Martin's hand tightly, feeling his small fingers clutching hers with unusual force. Lena walked beside them, her face solemn beneath her woolen hat. They carried a single small suitcase. Anything more would have aroused suspicion. The station buzzed with the controlled tension that characterized all border crossing points. Volkspolizei officers checked papers, questioned travelers, occasionally pulled people aside for more intensive searches or interrogation. Greta spotted the woman waiting near the platform entrance, middle-aged with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, exactly as Fritz had described. When their eyes met, the woman gave an almost imperceptible nod and approached. "Cousin Greta," she said warmly. "How lovely to see you. And the children have grown so much." "Helga," Greta responded, embracing her as if they were indeed relatives. "Thank you for meeting us." "Of course. Let me help you with that suitcase. We don't want to miss our train." As they walked toward the border control checkpoint, Helga bent down to the children. "Remember our game?" she asked quietly. "You're my niece and nephew visiting from West Berlin. We had such a wonderful time with your East Berlin relatives. Didn't we?" Lena nodded solemnly. Martin looked confused but remained silent. "Your names are Lena and Martin Weber," Helga continued. "You live at 27 Kantstrasse in West Berlin. Your father works in a bank. Can you remember that?" Lena recited the information perfectly. Martin nodded. "Good." Helga straightened. "Now, the serious men in uniforms will ask us questions. Let me answer them. If they ask you something directly, just tell them about the toys your cousin showed you. Nothing else." They joined the queue for West Berlin residents returning home. Greta's heart hammered so violently she feared the officers would hear it. The forged papers Helga had slipped her felt like they were burning in her handbag. When they reached the control booth, a uniformed officer with cold eyes took their documents. He studied them, then looked at the 4 of them. "Purpose of your visit to the Democratic Republic?" he asked Helga. "Visiting family," she replied easily. "My sister lives in Prenzlauer Berg. These are her niece and nephew. The officer looked at Greta. Your relation to these children? A critical moment. They had prepared for this question. I'm their mother, she said, keeping her voice steady. My husband couldn't make the trip due to work commitments. Your husband's occupation? He works for Deutsche Bank in West Berlin. The officer studied the papers again, then looked at Martin, who was partially hiding behind Greta's coat. Hello, young man. Did you enjoy visiting your cousins in the East? Martin froze. Greta felt his hand tighten painfully around hers. They have a cat, he said finally, his voice small. A black and white one. I wanted to bring it home, but Mama said we couldn't. The officer's expression didn't change, but he nodded and stamped their papers. Proceed to the secondary checkpoint. Greta nearly collapsed with relief, but Helga's warning squeeze on her arm reminded her that they weren't safe yet. The secondary checkpoint involved a more thorough inspection, sometimes including searches of luggage and physical examinations. They passed through a corridor where armed guards stood at regular intervals, their faces impassive. Other travelers moved through the space with the same careful, controlled expressions. No one wanting to appear suspicious, everyone acutely aware of being watched. At the secondary checkpoint, a female officer instructed Greta to open their suitcase. She examined the clothing inside, checking pockets and linings with practiced efficiency. Finding nothing of interest, she gestured for them to continue. One final barrier remained. A pair of heavy metal doors controlled by guards who could deny passage at the last moment if anything seemed amiss. As they approached, Lena suddenly spoke up. Mama, will we come visit Aunt Magda again soon? I liked her cookies. Greta felt a flash of panic. There was no Aunt Magda in their cover story, but Helga smoothly interjected. Maybe in the summer, dear, when school is out. The guard at the door studied them for a moment, then pressed the button that released the lock. The heavy door swung open, revealing a platform where a train waited. A train to West Berlin. They stepped through, and Greta had to resist the urge to run. They boarded the train with deliberate calmness, found seats in a half-empty car, and sat in silence as the doors closed and the train began to move. Only when they passed the first West Berlin station, Charlottenburg, did Helga finally smile. You've made it, she said quietly. You're in the West now. Greta pulled her children close, tears flowing freely now. They were halfway to freedom, but George and Fritz still had to make the most dangerous crossing of all. March 9, 1963. East Berlin. George had spent the past 3 days in a state of suspended agony. With no direct way to communicate with Greta, he had no idea if she and the children had made it safely across. Fritz had assured him that no arrests had been reported that matched their description. A small comfort. Now it was their turn. Under cover of darkness, they made their way separately to a building on Bernauer Strasse, just east of the wall. The street had become famous as the site of dramatic escapes in the early days of the barrier. People jumping from apartment windows directly into West Berlin before the buildings were evacuated and their facades bricked up. George arrived first, using a circuitous route and the counter-surveillance techniques Fritz had taught him. Doubling back, suddenly changing direction, entering and exiting shops to detect followers. The apartment building looked abandoned, its lower windows boarded up, but a faint light showed from a basement window. He knocked in the pattern he'd been taught. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 taps. The door opened just wide enough to admit him, then closed quickly behind. A young man with dirt-streaked face and hands gestured for George to follow him down to the basement. There, in what had once been a coal cellar, he found 3 more men and a woman gathered around a crude map drawn on butcher paper. A hole in the floor, partially obscured by boards, led into darkness. You're the mathematician, one of the men said. Not a question. George nodded. Your brother-in-law isn't here yet. We don't move until everyone is present. The next 30 minutes were excruciating. George sat on an upturned bucket, trying to control his breathing, wondering if Fritz had been caught, if he himself had been followed, if at any moment the Stasi would burst through the door. When Fritz finally arrived, George nearly wept with relief. His brother-in-law looked haggard, his normally neat appearance disheveled. I had to take a longer route, he explained quietly. There was a patrol on Brunnenstrasse. The leader of the tunnel group, a student named Klaus, gathered them around the map. Listen carefully. The tunnel is 140 meters long, running beneath the wall and the death strip. It emerges in a bakery storage room on the western side. The tunnel is reinforced where possible, but sections remain vulnerable. You must move precisely as instructed. He pointed to various markings on the map. There are 3 tight spots where you'll need to crawl on your stomach. The ceiling is unstable in these areas. Any unnecessary movement could cause a collapse. The tunnel has minimal lighting, electric torches strung along the route. If they go out, remain exactly where you are until we restore power. What about air? George asked, suddenly concerned about the prospect of being trapped underground. We have a pump system, but it's primitive. The air gets thinner the further you go. Some people experience panic. If that happens, focus on your breathing and keep moving. Klaus looked at them gravely. Once you enter the tunnel, there's no turning back. Border guards patrol above, and they have equipment that can sometimes detect digging. If we hear activity above, we may need to move quickly or even seal the tunnel with you inside until it's safe. The implications were clear. They might be buried alive if something went wrong. Any questions? Klaus asked. George and Fritz exchanged glances. What was there to ask? Their options had narrowed to this single terrifying path. When do we start? Fritz asked. Now. You'll go first, Klaus told Fritz. Then you, he said to George. I'll follow last to ensure the entrance is properly concealed behind us. They removed their coats and outer layers. The tunnel would be hot and confining despite the March chill above ground. George was given a small pack containing water and a flashlight. Remember, Klaus said as Fritz prepared to descend. Move slowly, breathe steadily, and follow the lights. Western handlers will meet you on the other side. Fritz nodded, then lowered himself into the hole. George watched as his brother-in-law's head disappeared into the darkness. Then his shoulders. Then he was gone entirely. 5 minutes later, Klaus nodded to George. Your turn. The tunnel entrance was smaller than it had appeared. George had to contort his body to fit through the opening, then lower himself awkwardly onto the dirt floor below. The smell hit him immediately. Damp earth, sweat, and the acrid scent of fear left by those who had gone before. A string of dim bulbs illuminated the narrow passage stretching ahead. The ceiling was so low that even crouching, George's head brushed against the wooden supports. The walls were shored up with scavenged lumber, bed frames, and what looked like pieces of furniture. Anything to prevent the earth from collapsing inward. He could see Fritz about 10 meters ahead, moving slowly in a crouched position. George began to follow, acutely aware of the tons of earth above him, of the death strip directly overhead, of the guards who would shoot without warning if they discovered the tunnel. The passage narrowed as they progressed, forcing them lower and lower until they were crawling on hands and knees. The air grew noticeably thicker, harder to breathe. George's shirt was soaked with sweat, his palms raw from the rough floor of the tunnel. They reached the first of the constricted sections Klaus had warned about. Ahead, Fritz had flattened himself entirely, wiggling forward on his stomach like a snake. George followed suit, pressing his body into the damp earth, using his elbows to pull himself forward inch by excruciating inch. The space was so tight that his back scraped against the ceiling. Dirt showered down with each movement. He could hear his own breathing, rapid and shallow, echoing in the confined space. A primal fear of being buried alive clawed at his mind, but he forced it down, focusing instead on the image of Greta and the children waiting in West Berlin. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. George froze, heart pounding. If the power failed completely, they would be plunged into absolute darkness. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the tunnel began to widen again. George could once more rise to his hands and knees, then to a crouch. Fritz was visible ahead, moving faster now. A sound stopped them both, a muffled thump from above. Everyone froze. Another thump, then what might have been voices. Klaus, who had caught up to them, whispered harshly, Border Patrol. Don't move. They remained motionless, barely breathing, as footsteps passed directly overhead. A flashlight beam penetrated through a tiny crack in the ceiling, sending a thin shaft of light into the tunnel. Then darkness again as the patrol moved on. "We need to move faster," Klaus urged after several agonizing minutes of silence. They sometimes double back. The final stretch of the tunnel sloped gently upward. George's muscles burned from the awkward positions and constant tension. His lungs strained in the thinning air. But ahead, Fritz had reached what appeared to be the end. A vertical shaft with crude ladder rungs hammered into the dirt wall. One by one they climbed. Fritz first, then George, finally Klaus. At the top, a trapdoor had been built into what looked like a storage room floor. Fritz pushed it open cautiously, then pulled himself up and out of sight. When George emerged moments later, he found himself in a small, dimly lit room stacked with flour sacks and baking supplies. The smell of bread permeated everything. Fritz stood nearby, being handed a glass of water by a young woman in a baker's apron. "Welcome to West Berlin," she said simply. March 10, 1963. West Berlin. The safe house in Kreuzberg was a modest third-floor apartment with sparse furniture and blackout curtains. When George and Fritz arrived, escorted by members of the escape network, the door flew open before they could knock. Greta stood there, her face transfigured by joy and relief. Behind her, Lena and Martin peered out uncertainly until they recognized their father and uncle. "Papa!" Martin broke free, launching himself into George's arms. The family clung to each other, all talking at once, laughing and crying simultaneously. They were alive. They were together. They were free. Later, after the children had finally fallen asleep, all four of them crowded into a single bedroom. George, Greta, and Fritz sat at the small kitchen table, speaking in low voices. "What happens now?" Greta asked. Their escape helper, a West Berlin University student named Dieter, no relation to the party informant at Humboldt, explained the process. "You'll be processed as refugees from the East. There's emergency housing for now, then relocation to West Germany if you choose. The government provides integration assistance, language classes if needed, job placement, educational support for the children." "Will the Stasi try to find us?" George asked. Dieter didn't minimize the danger. "They might. They've been known to send agents to track down prominent escapees. But you'll have new identification, and there are thousands of refugees. You won't be as high priority as a political dissident or military defector." "And those we left behind?" Fritz asked quietly. "Will there be reprisals?" This was the question that had haunted them all. The cost their escape might impose on friends, colleagues, and extended families still in the East. "It's possible," Dieter acknowledged. "But your departure was clean, no evidence of your escape route, no accomplices they can identify. As far as they know, you simply disappeared. Many will assume you're in prison, not in the West." George knew this was small comfort. Their absence would be noticed. Questions would be asked. Suspicions would fall on anyone connected to them. "We should move further west," he said finally. "Bavaria, perhaps, or the Rhineland, somewhere far from Berlin." Fritz nodded in agreement. "We start over completely. New names, new history." "And the wall?" Greta asked. "How long will it stand?" Dieter shrugged. "Who knows? A year? 10 years? Forever? The Soviets aren't leaving anytime soon, and neither are the Americans. Berlin will remain divided." George reached across the table, taking Greta's hand in his. "But we won't be," he said. "Not anymore." June 15, 1989. Munich, West Germany. The television showed crowds gathering in Berlin as U.S. President Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate, challenging the Soviet leader. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Georg Vasser, now known as George Valman, watched from his comfortable living room in Munich, where he had built a new life as a professor at the Technical University. Beside him sat Greta, her hair now streaked with silver, and their grown children with families of their own. "Do you think it will ever happen, Papa?" Lena asked, bouncing her own young daughter on her knee. George exchanged a glance with Fritz, now elderly but still sharp-eyed and alert. Both men had spent decades looking over their shoulders, expecting at any moment to be discovered, to be snatched back to the east. That fear had faded but never completely disappeared. "Everything ends eventually," George said. "Even walls." He thought of that night in the tunnel, of the border crossing at Friedrichstrasse, of the apartment on Bernauer Strasse. All now distant memories from another lifetime. Their escape had been one of the last successful tunnel crossings before that particular route was discovered and sealed by the Stasi. In the years that followed, the wall had grown more sophisticated, more deadly, claiming dozens of lives. But people had never stopped trying to cross it, by balloon, by swimming across canals, by crashing vehicles through checkpoints, by any means possible. Whether the wall falls next year or in another 20, George told his family, what matters is that we chose freedom when we had the chance. Outside, the sun was setting over a peaceful Munich street. His grandchildren played freely, without fear of informants or secret police. His children had grown up with opportunities he could never have imagined in the East. The wall had failed to hold them. One family among thousands who had risked everything for the chance at a different life. And against all odds, their plan had actually worked.